A pendulum metaphor illustrates college sports' current regulatory, legal, and financial environments, and where athletes truly sit in their relationship with institutional stakeholders. College sports regulatory and business models have been impervious to meaningful change. Throughout milestone events portrayed as threats to whatever status quo existed at the time, college sports institutional overlords have retained iron-fisted control over every aspect of the college sports industry. The four pendulum points show the decades-long tension between institutional control and athletes' rights, between past and future, and between mythology and reality. The red ball on the left-hand side represents the monopoly the NCAA and later the Power Five have had over the regulation and business model of college sports. This is what I call the stuck point in favor of NCAA Power Five interests. The college sports regulatory and business models have been in this position since the 1950s, and they have barely budged. And that just speaks to the power that the NCAA has wielded over college sports for the last 70 years. Through decades of NCAA propaganda and cultural acquiescence to college sports mythologies, most Americans view the red ball, that stuck position, as true equilibrium and the starting point in assessing athlete interest and quote-unquote progress. Next, we have the blue ball. This pendulum point represents the cumulative impact of athlete challenges to NCAA compensation limits, amateurism-based rules in the 21st century. This pendulum point represents the net progress in athletes' rights. In the space between the red and blue balls sits one, federal antitrust litigation. And in O'Bannon, the name, image, and likeness case, athletes achieved the full cost of attendance scholarship. That was the only remedy that came out of that case. And then in Austin in 2021, athletes achieved the Austin education benefit. It's important to understand that both of those benefits are permissive. Schools do not have to provide them. And even in the FBS division, the highest level of sports, the big time sports sweepstakes, a lot of schools aren't offering the Austin benefit. And the other thing is that both of those benefits are essentially maxed out. The full cost of attendance scholarship ranges from $2,000 to $6,000 a year. It's based on federal financial aid guidelines, and it's designed to help students and athletes pay for the extra expenses of attending college. And it's only going to go up incrementally as federal aid guidelines allow that cost of attendance stipend to go up. The Austin education benefit is fixed at $5,980, and that is not going to go up. And not only is that a permissive benefit, but schools can provide less than all of it, and they can decide what the eligibility criteria are. So athletes' access to that money is maxed out in the best case scenario at $5,980 a year. So those two benefits combined, the net benefit of federal antitrust litigation so far has been two really modest benefits. Second, in that space between the red ball, the stuck point, and the blue ball, you have Power Five autonomy legislation from 2014 and 2015, which they enacted with the federal judiciary's boot on their throat in O'Bannon. Then number three, we also have employee status fact-finding through administrative agency action. We had the Northwestern case in 2014 where the football team tried to unionize. They were successful early, and then the national board essentially neutralized any possibility of Northwestern moving forward with their unionization claim. Then we had in 2022, University of Southern California is facing a charge for a substantive violation of the NLRB that hasn't been resolved. And then most of you have heard about the Dartmouth case, and Dartmouth recently formed a union. The men's basketball team formed a union, and that case is now on appeal. And I just want to quickly note that the Dartmouth basketball team's successful unionization attempt has grabbed headlines, but its effect is really going to be marginal if it's not overturned in the current appeals process, and that could take up to 2 years. Dartmouth is an outlier in Division I sports as a member of the Ivy League. They're not in the big time college sports sweepstakes. And Dartmouth has a history of student worker unions, non-athlete unions. So any collective bargaining benefits the players might get at some point way down the line are likely to be modestly aligned with what other student labor organizations have already achieved. Number four, between the red ball and the blue ball, are nil opportunities with third parties. And we had the interim policy in 2021, which exists in spite of the NCAA, not because because of it, and it is interim until what? The NCAA and Power Five get absolute protections and immunities from Congress that would allow them to do whatever they want to with nil. Then we also have the one-time transfer option that came into effect in April of 2021, and that likewise is at risk. But both the nil opportunities and the one-time transfer option have been targeted in Congress, and there are a number of bills that are pending right now that would give the NCAA and the Power Five to completely roll back those markets, and athletes need to understand that. They need to know what's happening in Congress, and they need to know what's in these bills. So when we look at all of this change, all this reform, in the aggregate and the total net effect, it's really quite modest. And is it progress from the 1950 athletic scholarship? Yes. And it's also important to acknowledge that these modest financial enhancements, the cost of attendance scholarship, the Austin benefit, are really important to athletes who come from challenging financial circumstances. So we're not in any way suggesting that these aren't important. But on the backside of that, amateurism, the student athlete, and the collegiate model are as much alive today as they were before O'Bannon and before Austin and before the NLRB cases and before the new nil market and before the one-time transfer market. In short, while athletes have more in the way of enhancements to the old athletic scholarship, they have no more power, at least not yet, than they did before O'Bannon. The black ball represents a true reality-based equilibrium free from NCAA and Power Five mythology, fear-mongering, or 7 decades of iron-fisted control over college sports. The black ball assumes a hypothetical bargaining table where all interested parties have an equal seat and equal standing. The problem for athletes is that when you look at what is happening right now in Congress, federal courts, all these external regulatory pathways, the only parties that are at the college sports bargaining table are the NCAA, the Power Five, Congress, and class action antitrust lawyers. Athletes do not have a seat at any of those tables. And the NCAA and Power Five and Congress, they don't really want to hear from the athletes. And they've made that very clear by excluding the athlete voice, particularly Power Five football, men's and women's basketball players, from the 12 congressional hearings that have occurred over the last 4 years. So in essence, in response to the increased pressure from external regulatory forces, the NCAA and Power Five have chosen to do their collective bargaining with everyone except the athletes. Now let's look at this green ball. The green ball represents a false reality progress point. This is where the NCAA and Power Five want stakeholders, decision makers, and the public to believe athletes now sit. And I believe that if you were to poll Americans on the current relationship between athletes and institutions using this pendulum metaphor, they would likely point to the black or green ball or somewhere in between. And that's a victory for the NCAA and the Power Five. Many Americans believe that because athletes have nil opportunities and they have more mobility in the transfer market, they should just be grateful and stop complaining. You know, problem solved or enough is enough seems to be a common public sentiment. But it's so important to understand that those new market features are at risk if the NCAA and Power Five get what they want from Congress. It's also important to understand that when assessing athlete progress, a lot of decision makers use bottom-up thinking. The NCAA and Power Five use this. They look at what the athletes didn't have before, and that's their baseline. And then this new benefit is some incredible change that's just transformative change in their view. And they're saying, look at all these wonderful things that athletes get. They've never had it better, and they should just stop complaining. But that view of the world is also held by some people in the athletes' rights movement, and I've heard some attorneys who've represented athletes, champion these benefits as transformative. And the problem with that bottom-up thinking is that if we want to lock in athlete benefits in the way we think about it into a 1950s model, when we are in the midst of some historic movement in the overall college sports marketplace, and the NCAA and Power Five don't want athletes to participate in that. And that's a 1950s view of the world. The pendulum problem sits so deeply in the DNA of the current college sports business model that even progressive stakeholders, decision makers, athletes' rights advocates, and athletes themselves fall prey to it. For more, follow DYK.